The moment I saw her smile after I signed the will, I realized there was something she wanted that had nothing to do with family. My name is Dorothy Hayes. I am 73 years old, and until that afternoon, I believed I understood the people closest to me. The signing itself was supposed to be simple. A routine update to my estate documents. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Just a widow making sure her affairs were organized after the loss of her husband. Thomas had been gone for nearly 3 years. Some mornings I still expected to hear his footsteps coming down the hallway. Other days, I could almost hear his voice reminding me to take my time with important decisions. That Tuesday, I sat inside a quiet law office reviewing pages that had already been discussed several times. My attorney, Richard Nolan, explained each section carefully. I signed where I needed to sign, initialed where I needed to initial. When everything was finished, he shook my hand and told me I had done the responsible thing. I felt relieved, organized, prepared. What I did not feel was suspicious. Not yet. Later that afternoon, my son Ryan suggested we celebrate with an early family dinner. It sounded harmless enough. Ryan had always tried to keep everyone together. His wife, Melissa, even offered to make dessert. By 6 o'clock, we were gathered around their dining room table. The grandchildren laughed about school. Ryan talked about work. Melissa smiled often and refilled everyone's drinks before they were empty. If someone had taken a photograph of that evening, it would have looked like the picture of a happy American family. For most of dinner, everything felt normal. Then Ryan stepped away to answer a phone call. One of the children ran upstairs to find a missing backpack. I was collecting plates when I heard Melissa speaking to a friend near the kitchen doorway. She did not know I was close enough to hear. "Well," she said with a soft laugh, "at least everything is finally settled." There was something about the way she said it that made me stop. Not the words themselves. The tone. Relief. Satisfaction. Almost excitement. A few seconds later, she noticed me standing nearby and immediately changed the subject. Her smile returned. Warm. Polite. Perfectly controlled. But for the first time since meeting her 15 years earlier, that smile did not feel genuine. Driving home later that night, I kept replaying the moment in my mind. Perhaps I was imagining things. Grief can make people sensitive. Age can make people cautious. I told myself there were countless innocent explanations. Maybe she was talking about something unrelated. Maybe I had misunderstood. Yet the uneasy feeling refused to leave. The next morning, I stood in my kitchen holding a cup of coffee and staring out the window at the maple tree Thomas planted decades ago. For years, I trusted my family completely. I never questioned their intentions. I never looked for hidden motives. But something had changed. Not because of a document. Not because of money. Because of a smile. It was a small thing. The kind of thing most people would forget within minutes. I could not. Deep down, I knew that smile meant something. And before long, I would discover that signing the will was only the beginning of a story I never saw coming. The strange feeling followed me through the rest of the week. I tried to ignore it at first. After all, grief changes the way a person sees the world. Since Thomas passed away, I often found myself paying attention to details that never seemed important before. An empty chair, a forgotten photograph, a familiar song playing in a grocery store. Small things carried more weight than they once had. Yet what bothered me about Melissa was not a memory. It was a pattern that seemed to be quietly forming around me. Looking back, I can see that the changes started long before I noticed them. After Thomas died, Melissa became more involved in my life. At first, I appreciated it. She offered to help with errands. She checked on me after doctor's appointments. She even brought over homemade soup during the winter. Ryan often worked long hours, so it seemed natural that she would step in. I was grateful. I believed her kindness came from genuine concern. For a while, that belief gave me comfort. During those difficult months, I felt lost. Thomas and I had been married for 48 years. Nearly every routine in my life included him in some way. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, evening walks through the neighborhood, coffee together before sunrise. Suddenly, all those routines belonged to the past. The house felt larger, quieter, sometimes unbearably quiet. Melissa seemed to understand that loneliness. At least that is what I thought. But over time, her questions became more frequent. They also became more specific. One afternoon, while helping me organize old documents in my study, she casually asked whether I still kept all my financial records in the same filing cabinet. Another time, She wondered aloud whether maintaining such a large house made sense for someone my age. A week later, she asked if I had considered simplifying my investments so that things would be easier for Ryan one day. None of those questions seemed inappropriate on their own. In fact, each one sounded practical, responsible even. Yet together they created a feeling I could not quite explain. The focus always seemed to return to the same subjects: property, accounts, future plans, ownership. I told myself I was overthinking things. Melissa had always been organized. She liked planning. She liked solving problems before they happened. Maybe that was all this was. Even so, I started noticing other details. When family conversations turned toward finances, Melissa listened more carefully than anyone else. When someone mentioned retirement communities or estate planning, she became unusually engaged. Once, during Sunday dinner, I caught her studying the framed photograph of Thomas and me hanging above the fireplace. Her expression was impossible to read. The moment she noticed me watching, she smiled and changed the subject. By Friday afternoon, the uneasy feeling had settled firmly in my mind. I was standing in the hallway outside my bedroom when I realized something that made me stop cold. For months, I had been explaining away every concern, every question, every coincidence. But what if they were not coincidences at all? What if the smile I saw after signing the will was not the beginning of the story? What if it was simply the first time I finally noticed it? The following Tuesday, a large envelope arrived in my mailbox. At first, I assumed it was another advertisement. Since turning 70, I seemed to receive a steady stream of brochures about retirement communities, insurance options, and financial planning services. Most of them went directly into the recycling bin without a second glance. This one was different. My name appeared on a printed label instead of handwritten marketing material. Curious, I carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen table. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the window above the sink, illuminating the envelope as I carefully opened it. Inside was a collection of documents related to estate planning consultations and property transition services. Several pages described ways families could simplify future asset transfers. None of that surprised me. What caught my attention was a page near the back. Attached to it was a customer inquiry summary. Someone had recently requested information regarding planning options connected to my address. I read the page twice. Then a third time. My house was listed correctly. So was my name. Yet I had never requested the information. For several minutes, I sat silently at the table, trying to think of a reasonable explanation. Perhaps it was a clerical mistake. Perhaps someone entered the wrong address. Mistakes happen every day. Still, the timing bothered me. Only a week had passed since the will signing. Only a week had passed since I noticed Melissa's strange smile. I folded the papers and set them aside. Throughout the rest of the afternoon, I tried focusing on other things. I watered the flowers on the back patio. I paid a few household bills. I even called an old friend from church. Yet my thoughts kept returning to that envelope. By evening, I decided to look more carefully at the documents. This time I noticed something I had missed earlier. A small handwritten note appeared on one of the pages. Most of it was difficult to read, but a few words stood out clearly. Future housing options, timeline discussion, family coordination. The note was incomplete, almost meaningless on its own. Yet it left me with the uncomfortable feeling that conversations were happening somewhere without me. Conversations involving my future. The next day, Ryan stopped by unexpectedly. He brought coffee and pastries from a bakery I liked. We sat together in the kitchen and talked about ordinary things. The grandchildren, gas prices, his workload. For a while, everything felt normal. Then he casually asked whether I had given any thought to downsizing someday. The question seemed innocent enough. Many people my age eventually move into smaller homes. Yet hearing it only 24 hours after finding the envelope made my stomach tighten. I smiled politely and said I had no immediate plans to move. Ryan nodded and quickly changed the subject. But after he left, I could not stop thinking about the coincidence. That evening, I retrieved the envelope from the drawer where I had hidden it. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had been resisting. What if Melissa's questions, the unusual smile, the estate planning documents, and Ryan's sudden interest in downsizing were all connected? The idea felt uncomfortable, painful even. I loved my family. I did not want to believe anyone was making plans behind my back. Yet as I sat alone in the quiet house Thomas and I had shared for decades, I realized something important. Ignoring a warning sign does not make it disappear. And for the first time, I felt certain that whatever was happening around me had only just begun. 2 days later, I made an appointment with Richard Nolan. I told his assistant that I had a few questions about the documents we had recently completed. Nothing urgent, nothing complicated. At least that was what I said. The truth was that the uneasy feeling had grown too large to ignore. On Thursday morning, I drove to his office under a gray sky that threatened rain. The building sat on the same corner where it had stood for decades. Thomas and I had visited there many times over the years. Walking through those familiar doors brought back memories I had not expected. For a moment, I could almost see Thomas sitting beside me in the waiting room, reviewing paperwork and making notes in his careful handwriting. Richard greeted me warmly and invited me into his office. After a few minutes of casual conversation, he noticed my expression and set his coffee cup aside. "Something is bothering you," he said. I smiled faintly. One of the reasons I trusted Richard was that very little escaped his attention. I handed him the envelope and the documents I had received in the mail. He reviewed them quietly. The room remained silent except for the occasional rustle of paper. The longer he read, the more serious he seemed to become. Finally, he placed the documents on his desk and folded his hands. "Dorothy, where did these come from?" I explained exactly how they had arrived and what had happened over the previous week. I told him about Melissa's questions. I told him about the comment I overheard after the will signing. I even admitted that I felt foolish for being concerned about what might simply be a coincidence. Richard listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair and stared out the window for several seconds. "You are not foolish," he said at last. "And you are right to pay attention when something feels unusual." His answer surprised me. I had expected reassurance. Perhaps even a gentle reminder not to worry. Instead, he opened a file cabinet and retrieved several folders. He spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing records connected to my estate planning documents. I watched quietly from across the desk. Eventually, he stopped on a particular page and frowned. "That is interesting," he murmured. My stomach tightened. "What is it?" I asked. Richard looked directly at me. "Over the past few months, my office has received several general inquiries regarding future property planning connected to your situation." My pulse quickened. "From whom?" He shook his head. "I cannot discuss private communications from third parties. However, I can tell you this. Some of the questions focused less on your wishes and more on what might happen after certain future events." I knew exactly what he meant. Future events. My house. My assets. My affairs. For the first time, the concerns that had seemed vague and uncertain began to feel real. Richard closed the folders and spoke carefully. "Dorothy, I want you to promise me something. Do not sign any new documents without bringing them to me first, no matter how routine they appear." I nodded immediately. "Do you think someone is trying to take advantage of me?" He considered the question before answering. "I think someone may be making plans that involve your future. The important thing is making sure those plans are actually yours." As I drove home that afternoon, rain finally began falling against the windshield. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt something shifting beneath the surface of my family. And deep down, I knew I was getting closer to discovering what it was. The weekend passed slowly after my meeting with Richard. I found myself noticing things I might have ignored before. Not because I was looking for reasons to distrust my family, but because once a question takes root in your mind, it becomes difficult to stop searching for answers. On Sunday afternoon, I decided to organize several boxes stored in the attic. Most of them had not been opened since Thomas passed away. Dust covered the lids. Old holiday decorations sat beside photo albums and keepsakes collected over nearly 5 decades of marriage. I spent hours sorting through memories, birthday cards, vacation photographs, handwritten notes. For a while, the simple task brought me peace. Then I discovered a locked document case I had almost forgotten existed. Thomas had always been meticulous when it came to paperwork. Important records were never left to chance. The key remained taped beneath an interior compartment exactly where he had once told me it would be. When I opened the case, I found several folders containing trust documents, property records, insurance information, and letters addressed to me. My hands trembled slightly as I began reading. Some of the papers were familiar, others were not. One folder immediately caught my attention. It contained a trust agreement Thomas had established years before his death. Richard had mentioned it briefly during previous estate reviews, but I had never studied the details myself. As I continued reading, I realized How carefully Thomas had planned everything. Multiple protections had been built into the structure. Ownership of certain assets remained under specific conditions. Decisions regarding property transfers required clear approvals. Various safeguards prevented outside influence over major financial changes. The more I read, the more I understood. Thomas had anticipated that circumstances could change after he was gone. He wanted to ensure that no one could pressure me into decisions that were not truly my own. Tucked inside the folder was a personal letter written in his familiar handwriting. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. I sat beside the attic window and began reading. The letter was not about money. It was not about property. It was about trust. Thomas wrote that grief often makes people vulnerable. He reminded me that kindness and dependence are not the same thing. Most importantly, he urged me never to surrender control of my future simply because someone claimed to know what was best for me. By the time I finished reading, tears filled my eyes. Not from sadness, from clarity. For months, I had been second-guessing my instincts. Every concern had been explained away. Every uncomfortable feeling had been dismissed. Yet Thomas had known me better than anyone. He knew I would eventually need the confidence to trust my own judgment. Later that evening, I called Richard. I told him what I had found. He listened carefully before confirming something that changed everything. "Your husband was very thorough," he said. "Many of the assumptions people might make about your estate are simply incorrect." I understood exactly what he meant. If someone believed they already knew how my future assets would be distributed, they were likely operating on incomplete information. After ending the call, I sat quietly in my living room watching the sun disappear behind the trees. For the first time since this strange situation began, I no longer felt confused. I still did not know the full truth. I still did not know exactly what Melissa wanted. But I knew something she did not. Thomas had prepared for possibilities neither of us could have imagined. And suddenly, I had. The feeling that whatever plans were unfolding around me were built on assumptions that would not survive contact with reality. After my conversation with Richard, I made a decision that surprised even me. I stopped looking for answers, at least on the surface. Instead of asking questions, I started paying attention. There is a difference. Questions make people cautious. Observation makes them comfortable. The following week, I continued my normal routines exactly as before. I attended church on Sunday. I met friends for coffee on Wednesday morning. I visited Ryan and Melissa's house twice to spend time with the grandchildren. If Melissa noticed any change in me, she never mentioned it. In fact, she seemed more relaxed than usual. Looking back now, I believe she felt confident. Perhaps she thought everything was moving in the direction she wanted. Confidence has a way of making people reveal more than they intend. One afternoon, I arrived with a tray of homemade cookies for the grandchildren. Melissa welcomed me warmly. Her mood seemed unusually cheerful. While the children played in the backyard, we sat together in the kitchen drinking iced tea. The conversation drifted from school schedules to vacation plans. Eventually, it returned to a subject I had begun hearing more often: simplifying life. Melissa described a couple she knew who had recently sold their large family home and moved into a smaller community. According to her, they were happier than ever. Less maintenance, less stress, more freedom. I nodded politely and listened. A few minutes later, she mentioned how difficult home ownership could become as people got older. Then she quickly added that she was only speaking in general terms. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The words changed. The topic remained the same. 2 days later, another small moment caught my attention. Ryan and I were sitting on the back porch while Melissa prepared dinner inside. We talked about baseball, rising grocery prices, and one of the grandchildren's school projects. Then Ryan casually asked whether I had considered creating a list of important accounts and passwords for future convenience. The question itself was reasonable. Many families discuss such matters. Yet it arrived alongside so many other conversations pointing in the same direction that it no longer felt random. I answered carefully and changed the subject. Ryan did not push further. That evening, after returning home, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing everything that had happened over the previous month. The smile after the will signing, the estate planning envelope, the questions about downsizing, the comments about future arrangements. None of them proved anything by themselves. But together they painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. The most surprising realization was not about Melissa. It was about me. For weeks, I had been reacting emotionally, worrying, doubting myself. wondering if I was imagining problems where none existed. That uncertainty had disappeared. I was no longer afraid of the truth, whatever it turned out to be. For the first time since Thomas died, I felt steady, focused, prepared. I did not know exactly what Melissa wanted. I did not know how far any plans had progressed. But I knew something important. If decisions about my future were being discussed, I intended to understand every detail before anyone else controlled the conversation. And somewhere deep inside, I sensed that the moment when everything would finally come into the open was getting closer with each passing day. The invitation arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. Melissa called and said she wanted to organize a family meeting the following weekend. Her voice sounded pleasant, almost cheerful. She explained that everyone had been thinking about the future and believed it would be helpful to sit down together and discuss a few important matters. I agreed immediately. The moment I hung up the phone, I knew this was the conversation I had been expecting. For weeks, small hints had been leading toward a larger moment. Now it had finally arrived. Saturday evening came with clear skies and unusually warm weather for the season. When I arrived at Ryan and Melissa's house, everything appeared perfectly normal. The grandchildren were spending the night with friends. The dining room table had been carefully arranged. A pitcher of iced tea sat beside a plate of cookies. Melissa greeted me warmly and invited me to sit down. Ryan seemed nervous. He smiled when I entered, but something about his expression felt strained. Once everyone was seated, Melissa began speaking. At first, her comments sounded reasonable. She talked about planning ahead. She talked about reducing future stress. She talked about making life easier for everyone involved. I listened quietly while she explained how many families benefited from simplifying complicated situations before they became urgent. Then the conversation shifted exactly where I expected it would. Melissa mentioned the size of my house. She described how difficult maintenance could become over time. She discussed rising costs, unexpected repairs, and the advantages of living somewhere smaller and more manageable. Her tone remained calm and friendly. Yet every point moved toward the same destination. Eventually, she placed a folder on the table. "We have been researching a few options," she said. Ryan nodded beside her. I noticed he avoided looking directly at me. Melissa opened the folder and revealed information about several retirement communities and smaller housing developments. The pages were organized neatly. Notes had been written in the margins. Certain sections were highlighted. It was obvious that significant time had gone into preparing the presentation. I glanced through the materials slowly. Everything looked professional. Everything looked thoughtful. Most importantly, everything looked planned. Melissa continued explaining the benefits of making decisions sooner rather than later. She emphasized convenience, security, peace of mind. If someone had walked into the room halfway through the conversation, they might have believed she was acting entirely out of concern. Perhaps part of her was. But by then, I had learned to pay attention to what people emphasized repeatedly. Once again, the focus returned to my future, my property, and my living arrangements. When Melissa finally finished speaking, the room became quiet. She looked at me expectantly. Ryan did the same. They were waiting for a reaction. Weeks earlier, I might have felt cornered. I might have become emotional. Instead, I simply smiled and thanked them for the information. The surprise on Melissa's face lasted only a fraction of a second, but I noticed it. She had expected resistance. She had prepared for objections. My calm response left her uncertain. "I will take some time to review everything," I said. Melissa quickly agreed. Ryan looked relieved. Yet as I gathered the folder and prepared to leave, a strange certainty settled over me. This meeting had not been a casual discussion. It had been the first formal step in a plan that had been developing for far longer than anyone wanted me to realize. And now that the proposal was finally on the table, I knew the next move would be mine. 3 days after the meeting, I called Ryan and asked whether we could all sit down together one more time. He sounded surprised, but he agreed immediately. Melissa seemed pleased when she heard the news. I imagine she believed I had finally reached a decision. In truth, I had. It was simply not the decision she expected. The following Sunday afternoon, I arrived carrying a leather portfolio that had belonged to Thomas. The same portfolio he carried to countless meetings throughout our marriage. It rested quietly beside me as we gathered around the dining room table. Once again, the grandchildren were away. Once again, the atmosphere felt carefully managed. Melissa began by asking whether I had reviewed the housing information. I smiled and told her that I had. She seemed encouraged. Ryan looked hopeful. For a moment, neither of them noticed the portfolio. Before we continue, I said calmly, there are a few things I would like to share. The room became quiet. I opened the portfolio and removed several folders. Property records, trust documents, letters, legal summaries. Nothing dramatic, just paper. Yet the moment the documents appeared on the table, I noticed a subtle change in Melissa's expression. Her confidence flickered. What is all this? She asked. Information, I replied. The kind every family should understand before making plans about the future. Ryan leaned forward as I carefully organized the papers. I began with the trust Thomas had established years earlier. I explained how certain assets were protected, how major decisions required specific conditions, how ownership structures were designed to prevent misunderstandings and outside pressure. Ryan listened attentively. Melissa remained silent. As the discussion continued, I handed Ryan a copy of the letter Thomas had written for me. He read it slowly. The room remained still. Every few minutes his eyes returned to the page. I could almost see his understanding changing. The assumptions he had carried for years were beginning to shift. Eventually, he lowered the letter and looked at me. I did not know Dad had arranged all of this, he said quietly. Most people do not, I answered. Melissa finally spoke. I'm not sure why any of this matters. We were only discussing options. Her voice remained polite, but the certainty I had heard during previous conversations was gone. Options are important, I said gently. So is knowing the full picture before proposing them. No one argued. No one raised their voice. That was never my goal. I simply continued presenting the facts. The trust. The protections. The intentions Thomas had documented long ago. Piece by piece, the conversation moved away from assumptions and toward reality. By the time I finished, the mood in the room had changed completely. Ryan sat quietly, processing everything he had learned. Melissa looked down at the table more than once. For the first time since this situation began, I felt no confusion, no anxiety, no uncertainty, only clarity. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the dining room floor, I realized something important. The documents themselves were not the real revelation. The real revelation was watching people confront information that did not fit the future they had imagined. And as I closed the final folder and returned it to Thomas's old portfolio, I knew the conversation that followed would reveal far more than any piece of paper ever could. For several moments after I closed the portfolio, no one spoke. The silence felt different from the silences that had filled the room before. This one carried understanding. Ryan sat staring at the documents spread across the table. Melissa remained unusually still. The confidence that had accompanied her during previous conversations seemed to have disappeared. Eventually, Ryan looked up. Why did nobody ever tell me any of this? He asked quietly. I could hear genuine confusion in his voice. Because your father never wanted money to become the center of our family, I replied. He believed people should do the right thing because it was right, not because of what they expected to receive someday. Ryan lowered his eyes again. The words seemed to settle heavily between us. Melissa finally broke the silence. I think this has all become a misunderstanding, she said. Everything we discussed was only meant to help. I studied her expression carefully. For the first time since this story began, I saw uncertainty where certainty had once lived. Perhaps she believed what she was saying. Perhaps part of her truly thought she had been helping. But intentions are not the same as actions. Helping is important, I said calmly. But helping starts by listening to what someone wants, not deciding for them what their future should look like. No one argued with that. Ryan leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. Mom, I am sorry, he said. The words were simple. They were not dramatic. Yet they carried more weight than anything else spoken that afternoon. I nodded gently. I know. And I did. Ryan was not a cruel man. His mistake had been allowing assumptions to replace conversations. He had trusted that someone else understood what was best for me instead of asking me directly. That realization seemed to trouble him more than any trust document ever could. As the discussion continued, the atmosphere gradually softened. The focus shifted away from houses, planning, and future arrangements. For the first time in months, we spoke honestly. Not about property, not about inheritance, about family, about Thomas, about the years we had shared together, about the values he tried to leave behind. By the time the sun began setting outside the dining room windows, the tension that had defined so many recent conversations had finally begun to fade. Before leaving, I gathered the documents and returned them to the portfolio. Ryan walked me to the front door. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he smiled sadly and shook his head. Dad always thought ahead, did he not? I smiled back. He did. Driving home that evening, I felt lighter than I had in a very long time. Not because I had won something. Not because someone else had lost. The greatest relief came from knowing that I no longer doubted myself. For weeks, I questioned my instincts. I worried I was imagining problems that did not exist. In the end, the truth was simpler than I expected. The documents protected my future, but they were never the most important thing Thomas left behind. His greatest gift was the reminder that my voice still mattered. My choices still mattered. My life still belonged to me. As I pulled into my driveway, the porch light illuminated the home Thomas and I built together decades earlier. I sat quietly for a moment before going inside. The house no longer felt uncertain. It felt like mine. And as I stepped through the front door, I realized something I wished I had understood sooner. The day I signed those papers did not make me vulnerable. It reminded me that the person holding the pen was still me.